Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, the Air Force's largest and oldest bomber is getting upgrades to stay in the fight. Find out about the future of the B52 Strat Fortress. Also, the Army scrubs a multi-billion-dollar helicopter development program as the prototypes were about to take flight. Why the change of heart? Our expert is here to explain. And new helmets meant to protect against small arms fire are adopted in the Army. And the VA expands benefits to even more troops affected by toxic exposures. And the Marines promise a wall-to-wall inspection of barracks across the Corps, following the exposure of ugly conditions experienced by troops. We learn about what that means. It's the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to Platoon, here on Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Andrea Scott. The B52 Strat Fortress has been part of the U.S. arsenal since the middle of the 20th century, and it's still flying missions. In fact, the Air Force plans for the venerable long-range bomber to remain a vital part of the force for several more decades, meaning some airframes could be nearly 100 years old by the time they're retired. So, how do you keep a decades-old plane flying as part of a modern Air Force? To find out, Defense News Air Warfare reporter Stephen Losey went to Barracks Air Force Base in Louisiana. Have a look at the first installment of our new series on the future of the B-52.
The B-52 Strat Fortress is one of the military's oldest and most iconic planes. It's already spent more than 60 years in the air, and the Air Force plans to keep these bombers flying for decades more, perhaps until they're almost 100 years old. It can fly up to 50,000 feet for almost 9,000 miles, even longer with aerial refueling, and has a bristling arsenal it can carry. Conventional bombs, precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles, nuclear weapons, and even in development hypersonic weapons. The Air Force is planning for the B-52 to make up a key portion of its future bomber fleet, alongside the B-21 Raider stealth bomber that's coming online in the next few years. With the B-1 Lancer and B-2 Spirit on the way to retirement, this will be the most sweeping revamp of the US bomber fleet in a generation. But the B-52 is showing its age and needs some major upgrades, top to bottom, if it's gonna last until around 2060. On the way are new engines, avionics, radar, weapons, displays, and more, all the way to new wheels and brakes. So how is the Air Force planning to keep a 100-year-old bomber flying and ready to fight? I recently visited Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana to find out. For Military Times and Defense News, I'm Stephen Losey, and this is What's New with the B-52. One of our first stops, as we learned about the B-52, was to visit Major General Jason Armagost, commander of the 8th Air Force, who oversees the B-52 fleet. He gave us a sense of why these bombers will be so important to the Air Force in decades to come, and how they're planning to keep them flying.
It's a different approach to engineering that made available that ability for it to fly that long, because you know, a good example is maybe the B-2 or now a more advanced version of that, the B-21 with models-based systems engineering. One of the things that you benefit from in models-based systems engineering is you say, I think that this design will behave a certain way, and then when I test it, you validate the model itself. You don't validate even almost your physical object. And by doing that, what you're building out a case where you say, this will behave a certain way and it's very predictable to me.
Armagost also outlined how he saw the B-52 being used in the years ahead, alongside the Air Force's next stealth bomber, the B-21 Raider.
When Global Strike Command moves to that two-bomber force,
What's that going to mean as far as how Global Strike tasks its missions?
So one of the things kind of in that learning environment that we really focus on is at the very highest principled level is joint command and control. And so command and control plays out through our forces, but it also plays out through the combatant commands. And so I think we're learning how to best do that. So what do we know now about what that future operating environment will have or require is a different approach to communications and data and the sharing of that, and the resiliency of that, frankly, in denied environments, whether it's a denied information environment or a denied air environment. The B-21 with the B-52J is a very powerful integrated force, and so how I would see against near-peer adversaries operations being conducted has more to do with how we integrate those two things rather than how we pick individual actions for individual platforms.
But keeping a plane as old as the B-52 in the air and able to fight a modern war is quite a challenge. For example, how do you find parts for planes old enough to have flown missions in the Vietnam War? Here's Colonel David Miller to tell us what it takes.
All weapon systems, new and old, come with challenges. When you take a look at some of the older weapon systems, I think the largest challenge is really the defense industrial base. The slow atrophy over a long period of time of capabilities that exist outside of the service members' purview. When you start to look at the commercial sector, trying to entice vendors to want to continue to make very old, very difficult parts in small numbers is a challenge. With the size of the fleet, it's 10% of what it used to be. We had over 744 aircraft, now we're down to 76 aircraft. So we don't need as many of those parts as we did in the past. It requires an older technology to go get it, and the vendor base is just drying up with an appetite to do that kind of workforce. So the largest challenge is the defense industrial base in some regard.
Can you give me an example of some of the parts where the manufacturing source has dried up, companies have gone out of business, even like small things to big things?
Absolutely. So let me take this to the TF-33 engine. It has been around for a very long time, but getting parts for the TF-33 is very difficult, even as aggressive as we have been on the supply chain management side and the program office side of finding vendors. And when we go to the F-130 engine, the Rolls-Royce new engine, that's going to be I would say not an evolutionary gain for our maintainers, but a revolutionary gain. The leap between the two engines can be so significant that what we're buying into is an aircraft that's not going to have to go through core maintenance very often, if at all.
The biggest headaches for maintainers come from the B-52's original 1960s era engines. Many of the companies that originally made parts for those TF-33 engines went out of business years ago. But on the way to replace them, a set of new Rolls-Royce F-130 engines that will bring improved efficiency, range, and a fresh supply chain of spare parts due to be delivered to the Air Force later this decade. What are some of the most common issues you see when a B-52 comes back from a mission or comes into the shop or needs to be maintained? What's the most common troubleshooting things?
So there's a variety of things. You can go a week and the aircraft comes down fine every time, or every flight you could have a different issue. So the engines are one piece that shares a commonality with many of the breaks we see. However, with upgrades coming, we're excited for that.
So long as the Air Force can keep finding ways to maintain its B-52s, it can keep them in the air. But they also need to train new generations of airmen to fly them. And when you put students up in the air controlling more than 92 tons of hardware, anything can happen. Join me in our next episode to get a look at some of the training required for air crews assigned to America's Strat Fortress fleet.
In headlines from around the military, paratroopers with the 82nd Airborne Division received the Army's newest helmet, the first combat helmet capable of withstanding small arms fire without added protection. While the next generation integrated head protection system may look identical to its predecessor, officials say it can deflect rifle rounds, while base models of the previous version could only stop pistol rounds and fragmentation. The service expects to field 190,000 of the next generation systems by 2028. And thousands of veterans exposed to Agent Orange while serving in the military will for the first time be eligible for fast-track disability benefits under plans unveiled by the Department of Veterans Affairs. The move is another major expansion of toxic exposure benefits for vets, this time including individuals suffering from illnesses dating back to the Vietnam War. The changes follow mandates included in the Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxics Act, better known as the PACT Act, passed by Congress in August 2022. In a statement, VA Secretary Dennis McDonough said the proposed moves would make it easier for veterans exposed to herbicides who served outside Vietnam to access the benefits they so rightly deserve. Rules outlining the change will still take several months to go into effect. The new proposal would give presumptive benefit status to veterans who served in locations where herbicides were tested, used, or stored outside of Vietnam. When we come back, the story behind why the Army killed a multi-billion-dollar helicopter development program. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In recent years, the Army has been on the hunt for next-generation aircraft, meant to fill the Armed Scout mission left vacant when the force retired the Kiowa Warrior helicopter. Dubbed the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft, by the start of 2024, more than $2 billion had been spent on the program, and prototypes from major defense companies were getting set for test flights. But in early February, the Army suddenly scrapped the program and announced other changes to its plans, saying it would pursue next-gen unmanned aircraft for the Armed Scout mission in the future. Why the pivot? Defense News' Jen Judson spoke to Daniel Woolfolk about the change.
Jen, the fledgling Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft program is no more all of a sudden. What happened?
So this is something that I don't think came as a major surprise. I think we'd heard rumors for a long time that the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft may not make it to the finish line. The Army at the same time was trying to procure an entirely other different aircraft, the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft, or FLRAA. So FLRAA and FARA, the two future vertical lift aircraft, they're trying to procure these two airframes at the same time. It was hard to imagine that that was realistic for budgets, especially as budgets get tighter and tighter for the Army. We knew they were going to have to make a tough decision at some point. I just think it came as a surprise right now that this was a decision that the Army wanted to make, mostly because a competition was already begun between Lockheed Martin's Sikorsky and Bell Textron. They had both built airframes. They were waiting for a specific Army-developed improved turbine engine program engine to get dropped in so they could start flying by the end of this year. But the Army decided to call it quits after spending about $2 billion on the program.
So was that entirely because of funding, or maybe they didn't want to pay for one thing for such a long time and maybe go a different route?
So I think it was a combination of things. I think the Army needs to start making tough decisions on some of their modernization priorities. They had a very ambitious list of things that they wanted to field by 2030 that would be capable of going into multiple domains and also against high-end threats, near-peer adversaries. So when you think about Armed Scout helicopter, for instance, the idea of potentially going the unmanned route is something that the Army, I think, was really starting to think seriously about. You saw Nagorno-Karabakh. You also see what's happening in Ukraine with unmanned aircraft systems. And so I think there was a realization that maybe this doesn't need to be a manned helicopter to fill this mission requirement of an armed scout. It's something that could be very suitable for some of the unmanned aircraft systems coming online. Technology-wise, that's getting better. There's far more UAS out there that we're seeing. Plus, the Army has the Apache attack helicopter, which can also serve the role of a manned helicopter in that mission set as well. It has been doing that along with Shadow unmanned aircraft systems since the Army retired the Kiowa Warrior back in, I think, about 2014 or so. So there was a combination of, do we really need a manned helicopter? Plus, we don't have much to work with at the budget here, and we have to start making tough decisions.
You mentioned Shadow and the smaller UASs. Those are also being replaced.
That's right. So in addition to deciding to cancel the FARA program, the Army also decided to retire the Shadow. That's not a surprise at all. That was something that they wanted to retire. It was just a matter of time, like how long they were going to wait until it was fully retired. They were already working on the Future Tactical UAS program, which would have replaced Shadows in the brigade combat teams, but now it seems that the Shadow is going to be retired at a more abrupt rate, along with Raven UAS. These are both unmanned aircraft systems that require runways and are just really legacy systems that need to go, especially now that we're seeing just a huge proliferation of high-end UAS now that could replace those. In addition to that, the Army has decided to go forward with another multi-year contract for the UH-60 Black Hawk Mike model, as well as build CH-47 Block 2 F model Chinooks for the active component. They originally were not going to do that. They were only going to field for the special operators. That was a decision made in 2018, actually, because they needed to have funding for future vertical lift. They felt that they could not afford the CH-47 Block 2 for the active component. And now they're going back and they're going to be fielding that. So they're investing some of this money into current fleet now that they weren't going to. And they're going to invest other money in accelerating the Future Tactical UAS program, as well as a variety of other UAS and air-launched effect programs as well, to both fill the Armed Scout gap, but to, I think, also help industry a bit too.
And the Black Hawk and the Chinook, one's a utility helicopter, one's a cargo helicopter.
Exactly.
They'll remain in those roles. They're not going to fill a gap in the
Exactly. Yeah, they will remain in their roles for as long as they will remain, as the Army decides.
And what have you heard from industry? What are the murmurs there?
Industry is not talking much. You can imagine that there's a bit of an upset to not be able to proceed into a flight test program, a fly-off competition. That was something everyone was looking forward to. Some of the technology, it's really interesting. Sikorsky has been long working on their X2 technology, which is a coaxial rotor blade. That was technology featured in their competitive offering for the FARA program, which they lost to Bell Textron, but it was also part of their FARA offering as well. So I think there's a big question mark. What's going to happen with that X2 technology that they've been developing for well over a decade? And Bell Textron was also working on an entire next generation attack recon helicopter. So it's hard to tell what's going to happen with some of this technology. The Army is going to allow the competitors to close out what they're doing across fiscal year 2024. Some of that technology could be transferred to other programs. The Army explained that last week. It's just unclear exactly what technology that will be. One of the interesting aspects of this, though, is that both of the aircraft were going to take the ITEP engine, which is the Army's engine. It's been under development for a long time. It's been quite delayed. And that's going to go into Blackhawks and Apache helicopters. It's going to replace their current engines eventually.
Big news, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
When we return, our personal finance expert has advice on wise ways to spend your tax return. Stay tuned. Welcome back. On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack is back with tips on what to do with your refund from Uncle Sam if you're getting a tax return this year.
What would you do if a pile of money landed in your lap? Aside from thanking your lucky stars, most people would probably splurge. Think of your tax return as that pile of money. You might not splurge, but you might just as easily spend it before thinking to save it. Your tax return isn't found money. It's your hard-earned money that the government withheld during the year being returned to you. So when you think of it like that, hopefully it motivates you to put it where it'll do the most good for you, a savings account or tackling debt. If you don't have an emergency fund set up, now's the time. You should have at least 3 months of living expenses set aside always. If you can, put your return into a money market savings account. That's even better. Or if you don't need the money right away, to get the highest interest rate for your money, Go for a certificate of deposit or CD. Then you're really maximizing your returns. If you've got high debt, use your return to pay it down or pay it off completely. At the end of the day, the smartest thing to do with any extra money is to use it to further your financial goals. Save the splurging for pizza.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, look up from that radar terminal to check out militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more headlines. And to be the smartest service branch leader testifying in front of Congress, sign up for our Early Bird Brief, compiled each morning to bring you the most up-to-date headlines. It's also an audio. Check out the podcast version out each weekday. And if social media is where you collect open source intelligence, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. And like most junior service members, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. When we come back, the Marines order a Corps-wide barracks inspection. Find out what the force is looking for. When it comes to housing for junior troops, the military has a bit of a checkered history. The Marine Corps is the latest service branch to try to curb what can be substandard living conditions for troops, acknowledging that some of its barracks just aren't good enough, and that it could lead to Marines leaving the force. A forthcoming Corps-wide inspection of all Marines' barracks comes after photos were brought to light showing dead vermin, mold, and other filth in a California barracks. So what does the Corps plan to do? Marine Corps Times reporter Irene Lowenson has the report.
The Marine Corps' barracks aren't good enough. Lance corporals and privates know that too well. The service's leadership has publicly acknowledged it, and now has ordered a complete inspection of every Marine barracks building in the world. By March 15th, a leader of the rank of gunnery sergeant or higher must examine each barracks room and each squad bay in the Corps. Unlike the weekly room inspections known as Field Day, these inspections will be carried out by leaders from outside the chain of command. That's a change that's intended to bring external scrutiny to problems. These leaders will assess whether rooms are clean, safe, and healthy, with functional appliances and furniture. General Christopher Mahoney, the assistant commandant, said the inspection is a way for the Corps to get a baseline understanding of just what condition the barracks are in.
These inspections are about setting the conditions for the kinds of changes we're getting after in our larger Barracks 2030 initiative. To that point, this inspection will give us a good baseline understanding of the condition of all our barracks so we can identify and allocate resources accordingly.
The service's barracks are more than 3 decades old on average. Some are moldy, some lack hot water, some are just generally dilapidated. At one barracks in California, a raft of damning photos showed apparent mold, dead rodents, and other unsanitary conditions. After we asked the Marine Corps about these photos, a 3-star general vowed to inspect that building himself. In a recent hearing in front of the House Armed Services Committee, the senior enlisted Marine, Sergeant Major Carlos Ruiz, addressed the importance of better quality of life for Marines.
The quality of a Marine's home is as essential to their readiness as to the ranges they train on. The barracks are a physical manifestation of what we value and prioritize, and our Barracks 2030 strategy includes a deliberate investments to improve our barracks within the Corps. By providing quality living spaces, we are giving Marines a visible reminder that we are indeed investing in them.
The Marine Corps has a plan for fixing its living quarters, a plan called Barracks 2030. The Corps will install civilians to manage the barracks rather than placing that responsibility on Marines. Other short-term steps will include fixing broken locks, replacing furniture, and putting in place new maintenance teams. But long-term solutions will prove expensive, in the order of billions of dollars.
Although the budget is tight, our leadership, your leadership, is paramount, and its impact far exceeds any amount of money we can put in a budget. Commanders and senior enlisted leaders, if your barracks have issues, if there are problems, get out there and own it. Our Marines deserve our best.
Marine leaders say fixing the barracks is a necessity, because if housing isn't up to snuff, good Marines will leave the Corps. For Marine Corps Times, I'm Irene Lowenson.
And that's all we have time for in this episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.